This is Dr. L, and this is a short video about ATP and energy coupling. Pause for a moment and take a look at the learning objectives, although I think we're actually not going to talk about redox reactions too much, just a little at the end. Adenosine triphosphate, which is the shorthand for that is ATP, is the chemical drawn here. And it consists of three phosphate groups. A PO4- is a phosphate group. So we've got 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so hence triphosphate. Adenosine diphosphate would have 2. Adenosine monophosphate would just have 1. A ribose sugar, and this nitrogenous base here, which is called adenine. It's a little hard to see the chemical bonds, but there's the chemical bond here connecting the adenine to this sugar group. Okay, so you will recognize this structure from if you know anything about DNA and RNA, in that adenine is a common nitrogenous base. It's the A in A, T, C's, and G's for DNA. It's also nicknamed, this molecule is nicknamed the energy currency of the cell. So it's a really important molecule in cellular energetics. And one of the reasons for that is that it is an incredibly high energy molecule. It's really high energy because of these 3 phosphate groups, which have negative charges. Therefore, they're extremely electron dense, and so there's a lot of repellent force. The electrons are repelling one another, so there's a lot of chemical energy tied up in each single molecule of ATP. That means that when you hydrolyze or break down ATP to form ADP, which is what this reaction is here. Here's ATP at the top, release of a water, and ADP, adenosine diphosphate, 1 and 2 phosphate groups instead of 1, 2, 3. So ATP getting converted to water plus ADP is called ATP hydrolysis. And it releases a substantial amount of chemical energy. So this ATP hydrolysis is a very exothermic, spontaneous reaction. In contrast, in cells, there are a lot of endothermic reactions. An example of that is the synthesis of glutamine, which is an amino acid. And one of the ways glutamine can be synthesized is to take glutamic acid, another amino acid, add pneumonia, NH4, and convert them to glutamine. And this is something many cells need to do. However, it's very energetically difficult. It is not spontaneous. It is not endothermic. So here I've shown you a reaction that's incredibly exothermic and spontaneous and releases a lot of free energy. Here I'm showing you a reaction that is very endothermic. It will only happen if energy goes in. The cell can do both these reactions. And so the solution for cells, in that they need to be able to do many different kinds of endothermic reactions, the ways that they make those happen is they involve ATP in a process called energy coupling. So they couple ATP hydrolysis, which I showed you a moment ago, and any endothermic reaction or some endothermic reaction. So here is a drawing of the reaction I just showed you. Glutamic acid plus ammonia getting converted to glutamine. Very positive delta G, very non-spontaneous, not thermodynamically possible reaction as written. This is a very difficult reaction to do, and yet the cell needs it done. So it has to find a way to do that. The way that it finds is to link in ATP hydrolysis. So what happens is you take these reactions and you split them up. So you take glutamic acid and ATP, which the cell always has a lot of, or a pool of ATP around. And those are the reactants in the first reaction. And what happens is one of the phosphate groups from the ATP that gets released gets stuck onto the glutamic acid. So this is called a phosphorylation. A P from here goes onto this glutamic acid base and releases also adenosine diphosphate. So that's reaction 1. Because ATP has got so much energy associated with it, reaction 1 is an exothermic reaction. Very energetically favorable. Now you take the products of this first reaction, right, at least the phosphorylated glutamic acid, and you add in another reactant. You add in the ammonia. So your phosphorylated glutamic acid plus ammonia can then be converted to glutamine, which is what you wanted in the first place, plus a free phosphate group is released. So this second reaction is also energetically favorable. And so because both of these reactions are exothermic and spontaneous, they can happen. But the only way that they were able to happen is by adding in ATP and counting on ATP hydrolysis, which happened here. So you coupled ATP hydrolysis with an endothermic reaction, and you got some chemistry that is exothermic and therefore possible in the cell. It can be catalyzed by enzymes. You know, there's an overall negative delta G, and that's possible. So we took an endothermic reaction and we coupled it with an exothermic reaction, ATP hydrolysis, and we add those up together and you get a net negative, and that is theoretically possible, and so it can actually happen in the cell and enzymes can catalyze it. And in this way, ATP is really central to metabolism. So this is, I want to remind you that metabolism is all of the biochemical reactions that happen within an organism, and that those reactions are out there happening in a web, constantly changing. Reactants of one thing are products of another, and so on. And so here we've got ATP hydrolysis. And it is ATP hydrolysis that is linking reactions that tend to be exothermic to reactions that tend to be endothermic, reactions that release energy to reactions that require energy. By taking ATP and hydrolyzing it and using, that reaction, you can make these anabolic reactions and pathways run in the cell. It's what gives, what allows cells to work, to actually do the breaking down and the building up that they need to do to function. I know that's a lot. This is not an easy concept. In fact, if you continue in the sciences, you'll be studying this, more than one time. But it is a really important concept, and it's important to start kind of thinking in a more complex way and not just visualizing ATP as like the typical energy ball like it's drawn here, but an actual chemical that can participate in reactions, in a chemical way and drive reactions that would otherwise not be thermodynamically possible. Right, and that concludes this mini lecture.